Movement. So, welcome to the first ever Morris Bloch lecture here in the new Claris period, in School of Health and Wellbeing. Seems like a very auspicious occasion. My name's Andrea Williamson. I'm Professor of General Practice and Inclusion General Practice and Primary Care here in the School of Health and Wellbeing. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Adam Burley to give our first Morris Bloch talk in the building. So Adam is a consultant clinical psychologist. I know Adam from his previous role as the consultant for the Edinburgh Access Practice, which is for homeless people with homelessness in Edinburgh. He's subsequently also worked and continues to work with Simon Community Scotland, and has just this week been appointed the professional lead for trauma services in NHS Lothian, and I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about that. I asked Adam along to this particular do this talk because there's a team of us embarking on work about missingness in healthcare, research on that in general practice and primary care. And also as a clinician working in inclusion health settings and as a deep end GP, what Adam is going to go on and talk about today is a really important aspect of what we think is going on for patients, and is part of the jigsaw puzzle that contributes to the health inequalities that people experience when they're trying to access and use healthcare. Also, given that the exhibition out in the front of their building is very, and the whole sort of symbolism of the school health and wellbeing coming together is around tackling health inequalities, I think that gives extra value to what we're doing. So I'm going to hand over to Adam just now. What I want people who are online to do, if you don't mind, is if you come up with questions as the talk proceeds, please put them in the chat. I think it's really important that we try and sort of have questions both from people online and the people in the room today. Probably just for information, the folk that are online, I mean, how many folk are in this room? About 30 maybe? So there's about 20 to 30 people sitting in the room, and there's many of you zooming in from other places. Over to Adam.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's an honour to be here, and first speaker in this building. I will try and do it some justice. The title of the talk is Shining a Light on the Invisible, which hopefully will become clear as we go through it. I'm going to talk a bit about relationships. We'll know something about, but I want to explain a bit about what I mean about it. To bear with me through that bit because it's important for then what comes later. And then I'm going to introduce something about the concept of relational injury and relational access, which I think is the bit I really want to think about. And if we have time, we'll get onto relational care maybe. So yes, I'd say I'm going to start with relationships. I'm going to start with a quote from Donald Winnicott. Most of you, I'm sure, will have read loads of Winnicott in your time, I'm sure. For those who haven't, he was a pediatrician and then a psychoanalyst in the 50s and 60s and worked primarily with families and young people. And he's famous, obviously with a very small f, amongst quite nerdy circles for coming up with phrases like this: there's no such thing as a baby, which might be a surprise to some of you if you've either not a baby, seen a baby. For those who haven't, this one, not that one. Sometimes confusing. And what does he mean by this? Well, I think he means that for those who have seen babies, you'll remember that they are, when you get them home at least, they're almost entirely useless. They can't walk, they can't talk, they can't control their sphincters, they can't do very much really. And if you leave them for too long, they will be, in Winnicott's sort of euphemistic 50s language, no longer a going concern. By that, I think he means psychologically they won't be alive, and physically they won't be alive. So I think what he's getting at here is that there's no such thing as a baby on its own. For a baby to be a real going concern in the world has to be in relation to somebody else to survive physically and psychologically. And I guess the extension of that is that never changes. That never changes across the lifespan. It might become less pertinent or less visible as we go on. But actually, I think what he's arguing for, and what I'd be arguing for, is that we are relational beings across our lifespan. Health, well-being, and life outcomes are to a greater or lesser degree dependent on the quality and the nature of the relationships we have and by our ability to form and maintain those relationships. This is the tricky abstract bit, this next slide. External relationships are easier to describe because they are somewhat more visible. We're sort of in relation to each other, just I don't know where it is. It's somewhere back here somewhere. We can't actually see it, but we sort of know what we're talking about. Internal relationships are slightly more complicated to describe, but again, I think they're important because it's always worth remembering that in all of the work that we do, we'll be meeting people who have their own histories, their own internal worlds, which will have been governed by something of their relational experiences from the time they were born to the time they come and meet us, if we're lucky enough to meet them. And I'm going to do that through the medium of Calvin and Hobbes, this is as important literature as Winnicott. For those who haven't read Calvin and Hobbes, what have you been reading? You'll be reading this. And in this particular cartoon, for those who don't know Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin's a little 6-year-old boy. He's the boy with the stripy jumper, and Hobbes is his pet tiger. He's not a real tiger, you don't have to worry. He's a stuffed tiger. But when there's no parents in the room, no adults in the room, he's very much alive, and he's very much alive in Calvin's mind. So in this particular cartoon, Calvin's waking Hobbes up to tell him that it's bedtime. And Hobbes says, well, I wouldn't want to sleep through that. And Calvin says, well, I wonder why we dream when we sleep. Do our brains just get bored? I wonder why we don't just plain sleep. And Hobbes, ever the philosopher, says, well, I think we dream so we don't have to be apart for so long. We're in each other's dreams, we can play together all night. And Calvin's like, hey, yeah. He says, well, I'll see you in a few minutes, old buddy. He says, I'll be there. And then in this second last panel, they're sort of falling into unconsciousness. They're falling asleep, falling apart. And then in this last panel, they're asleep. But I guess the idea is, at least in my mind, I hope you can come with me in this idea, that there's now two Hobbeses and two Calvins. Calvin has a Hobbes in his mind, and Hobbes has a Calvin in his mind. And they're playing together, but they might be playing completely different games in each other's minds, that their minds are relationally constructed based on the external relationships that they've had up to the point where they happen to go to sleep. And in Calvin and Hobbes, it's nice and simple because they have this really close relationship. So they're the main actors in each other's sort of relational world, really. So it's really just to introduce the idea that it's an idea, it's not a truth, it's an idea that our minds are relationally constructed, that we have an internal world in relation to bits of ourselves, such that we might have parts of ourselves that think one thing and parts of ourselves that think other things, and they're in relation to each other. Like part of you might have thought, come to this lecture today, another part said, probably bunk off, no one will notice, stay home and watch Netflix. And then you had to have a discussion with yourself about whether you should come or whether you'd stay at home. And you couldn't do both. Like, it's not like a part of you. I tell you what, I'll stay at home while you go to the lecture. Like, you all had to come or you all had to stay at home. And that's the complexity of having an internal world that isn't always on the same sort of pages as each other. And we'll come back to why that's important, perhaps. But just to over-egg the relational bit a bit more, I might argue that relationships are like the psychological equivalent of breathing, that most of us have been breathing since we came into this lecture theatre today. In fact, most of us have been breathing since we were born. We're so skilled at it, we don't even notice we're doing it. We don't get to the end of the day and go, another day of breathing, aren't I clever? We just do it, and we can do things like breathe and drive and give talks and come to talks without even noticing it. It's something that just runs along in the background. But for those of you who have ever choked or seen anybody choke, you will know that breathing is the whole shooting match. It's everything. If you're not breathing, then you're not doing very much for very long afterwards. So breathing is invisible, in the background. You won't see it. It actually underpins most of our livingness, I assume. I mean, I'm not a medic, but that's true, isn't it? I think that's true. And relationships are a bit like that, like invisible in that way, that if we can do them well, they actually underpin just about all of our health and well-being, our life course, what our life looks like. But again, if they're going well, we don't tend to notice that we're doing it. We don't tend to go home at the end of the day and say, another day of successfully negotiating relationships with other people to get my emotional and psychological needs met. Aren't I clever? We don't say that. We just sort of do it. If we're lucky, we do that through primary school and through work, and we end up being things like psychologists. I asked my son the other day how he thought he'd done really well in his maths exam. He said, because I'm really clever. He didn't pay any attention to the fact that he'd had lots of relational scaffolding that got him to the point from being nappy to the point where he did his maths test. So great. Why is that important for us? I think because you can tell this is a real doctor, can't you?
Adam, please, can you share your screen?
Oh. Sorry, I thought it was shared. You missed all the fun pictures.
Yes.
We can start again.
Yep, sorry, Phil, and everybody else, you've missed the pictures.
Particularly sorry that we missed Calvin and Hobbes.
It's very good. I'll go back so quickly just so you can see. And just slide.
Is that better now?
Yes.
It's better, but can you go on to slideshow?
I'm going to stop sharing and just try again.
Yeah, I think you need to do the slideshow and then do the sharing. Yeah.
And then share. Have a shot.
I could have again. I think you need to tab then between.
Oh, I see. All this.
Yeah. So I do the slideshow and then tab to the Zoom screen and then.
Okay, hold on. Is it all?
Alt and tab, yeah. So Zoom
And then go share screen.
and then.
And choose. No.
There you go.
Is that-
Is that better for this?
Can everyone see that one?
Yes.
Yeah, that looks good.
Yeah. Excellent.
No, of course, the slides won't move on.
Joys of modern technology.
Oh, hold on.
Let me
We've
go.
got
Let's
action.
go into this.
There's the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. I'm hoping I'm getting extra time at the end for this.
Yeah.
Injury time. There was the breathing one, which is talked about as breathing being the relationships being the psychological equivalent of breathing, fundamental to our health and well-being. And so I'd come on to this really just as to illustrate the importance of relationships in the work that we do, in that I would argue that all healthcare is relational at some very basic level, like all education is relational, like all human life is relational. But particularly healthcare, it's a very fundamental relationship because often it involves a group of people coming asking for help, which is often the very first thing we do in life. We're in a state of vulnerability and we ask for help and hope that somebody is there to meet that vulnerability and take care of it and look after it in some way. And that's very much alive in the healthcare relationship. It's a group of people called healthcare professionals in relation to another group of people who we call patients or service users or Bob or Sue or whatever their name is, a range of things really. And if all's going well, it's a bit like John Lewis. I'm contractually obliged to put a John Lewis slide. I used to work for John Lewis, and John Lewis was great. I worked in the toy department. People would come in and they'd ask for toys, and you say, "That's good. We've got toys," and we get toys. And we give them toys, and they would buy those toys and give us money, and then say, "Thank you very much." It's a very sort of John Lewis world where everything went smoothly and well. And I guess that happens sometimes in healthcare where people come in and say, "I'd like some healthcare, please." And you're like, "Great, you've come to the right place," and you give them some healthcare, and they take that healthcare and say, "Thank you very much," use it as prescribed, and everyone gets better. You feel clever, and they feel better, and you get a card at the end of it. What didn't happen in John Lewis was people coming in saying, "I'd like a toy." We go and get the toy, and they go, "Not that toy." You go, "Okay, which toy would you like?" Something different, and then you bring a different toy, and they go, "No, I don't want toys at all." And it would go on like this. Like that never happened. If someone did that, we'd usually just get rid of them and say, "Like, you're pissing around. We're not here for that. We're here to sell toys," and we just get rid of them. But I think that happens probably a fair bit in healthcare where people come. If they do come, a part of them maybe asks for something, and then you try and attend to that, and then maybe something more complicated happens. We can talk a bit about what that complication in the relationship with care itself might actually be and what it might look like. I want to touch on adversity and in the broader sense, trauma, neglect, other sorts of mistreatment as a way of thinking about, I want to think about it in terms of from a relational point of view, that most complex trauma or trauma that's happened over period, you know, that's happened across people's development, often happens in relationships, with caregivers or with people who we might expect to be able to trust, or who are the only people there to attend to our needs, our primary healthcare providers. And certainly in the areas I've worked in, I've worked with plenty of people who really don't have a very good experience of that early healthcare relationship at all, actually. In fact, often their universal experience has been that care has not been something that can be trusted. It's been run through with pain, anxiety, and all sorts of other complications. And I'm going to come on to the term I might use for that, but I think just to forecast it here, I think that can give rise to what I might call a relational injury, as in an injury in the capacity to form and maintain relationships, breathe easily in that relational space that a lot of us might sort of take for granted, because the person has developed very understandable fear and anxiety about the business of attaching and connecting and trusting, reaching out for help, for being vulnerable at all in any sort of way in relation to another human being. And that's catastrophic, in the same way that, you know, a bird becoming fearful of flying would be catastrophic, and that a bird is very much organized around the business of flying. So some birds. I used to live in New Zealand where they had strange birds who didn't fly, but most birds fly. And if they become fearful of flying, then it's really against something very fundamental. And I think that's the case for human beings as well, that fundamentally we are relational beings. And so when trauma and adversity and pain happens in those relationships, we can develop a fear that's very, very life limiting, because it's so intrinsic to the business that we need of being a human being. We become phobic of the very thing that we need for life, which has all sorts of, you know, imagine health and social consequences, really, of which we spend a lot of the time trying to clear up in mental health services, drug services, homeless services, physical health services. I've lost movement again. Maybe the screen is good. So the thing, and so on the theme of invisibility, I've not got any medical training, but I think this is an injury. It's invisible. My son broke his arm. It was invisible. We couldn't see the bones because he had skin over it, but you could see something was wrong by the shape of his arm. And then he had an X-ray. It wasn't this X-ray, but it was a bit like this. And then we could see it. We made it visible. He said, I think, again, I think I felt very clever. I think that's the injury there, isn't it? And the doctor said, yeah. And they cast it and fixed it and all the rest of it. But it was a visible injury. It was something that could be seen and accommodated and attended to and looked after. And that's great. And that's the way it should be. I think there's something about relational injuries that are invisible. They're very hard to see, often because they happened historically, they're in the past, and that we can't actually see them. Sometimes we see the manifestations of them. Sometimes we're in relation to people where we find ourselves feeling injured, perhaps in the relationship we are with them. And maybe that gives us some sort of visibility of the nature of the injury. But for the most part, relational injuries are not easily seen. They're not a thing that we could so X-ray and go, I think the relational injury is here. It's a much more hard thing to sort of get our head around, particularly. As I say, I think we can see it sometimes in the dynamics that we're working with. This is, does everyone know who this is? For those who don't, this is a character from the Lord of the Rings trilogy who's in two minds, very much in two minds. A part of him called Smeagol, who's maybe an original part of him, and then another part called Gollum, who's had to develop to defend himself or protect himself against a world that he sort of sees as dangerous in some way. So he's very much in conflict with himself. And if you haven't seen it, I should have put the video up actually, there's a brilliant scene in the film where they're having a real ding-dong with each other. And basically Smeagol's saying, I think we can trust people now. I think it's safe. Like, we've met these people, they're good guys, we should trust them, we should go with them. And Gollum is saying, are you mental? Right? Have you not remembered what's happened to us? This is a terrible idea to trust anybody. We best look after ourselves, keep ourselves to ourselves, stay hidden. And there's a sort of conflict that goes on. There's a brilliant bit actually where Gollum reminds Smeagol, we're only here because of me. It's me that has kept us safe. It's me that's kept us alive. And I think that says a lot sometimes about some of the people I've worked with anyway, where the part of them that can at times seem very attacking and abusive and neglectful, maybe the part of them that had to develop to keep themselves safe and keep themselves alive, to attack connection, to attack relationships, because connection and attachment and relationships are the most dangerous thing you could ever do. It would be crazy, crazy to trust anybody. I work with someone, still know them, I worked for a long time, and she was brilliant at coming up with amazing phrases to capture things. And she had this lovely line, she said, "Oh, you've got to remember, we can only defend ourselves with the knives that were thrown at us," which felt like it really captured the sort of, this is all I have. When you come and try and get close to me, all I can do is try and kill you in the ways that I was killed off through the early part of my life, when I was in relationships that were frightening and threatening in some way. As Andrea pointed out, I think these are some of the dynamics that can underpin things like the inverse care law, and so again, more invisible elements of it. You'll probably read the original article, but there's a nice bit around, there are some people who seem to be able to navigate their way into care better than other people. Anyone see the hospital up there somewhere? But it's sometimes a complicated path to get there, and that's just in the physical world. But also there's a complication and sometimes a complicated route map to get there in the invisible relational world that we might expect or ask people to come and see us. There we are asking them to get into connection with us, to relate to us, to come along and meet us, to be vulnerable in relation to us, to tell us what's going on in their mind, to in any way sort of connect with us, which might seem obvious to a lot of us and easy, like breathing, we can all do it. But for some people, it might be very, very difficult. I suppose it's always struck me that a good chunk of our health and social care services were designed by relatively healthy people. We sort of designed them in our own image, I guess, which was, if I was sick, I would just rock up and go and say I was sick, like John Lewis. I would just go and ask for a kettle, wouldn't I? I'd just go and say, I'm sick, I need some help. And we could have that nice John Lewis transaction of healthcare, assuming that everybody has the same relational capital, same relational health, same ability to relationally access the services that we've developed, which I don't know is always the case. And I'd say that I think those are some of the psychodynamics that can underpin things like the inverse care law, in that those who are perhaps most relationally injured are the least likely to be able to come and access the help that might be of some benefit to them. This is just a sort of slide to illustrate, I won't stay long on this because I've talked a bit about it before, but to remind me to sort of talk about how important the sort of invisible relational structure underneath things actually is. So this is a picture of someone on a surfboard. It's not my son, but I took my son a while ago for a surf lesson in Dunbar, and we went to the car park and met this cool surfer dude guy who came up and said, "Hey dudes, go for a surf lesson." And he was off. He was like 11 years old and off he went. And I walked up and down the beach for an hour and then came back and picked him up and asked him how the surf lesson was. And we sat in the car on the way back to Haddington, and he told me all about it, all about the content of the surf lesson. Like, we went down the beach and we got the wetsuit on, there was some sand in it, and then we got in the sea and the water went in, it was a bit cold. And then he gave me some instructions and told me to paddle, and then I got up and then I fell off and it was cold again, but I managed to, and then I managed to surf. It was amazing. And I was like, oh, that's good, because I paid quite a lot of money. So I wanted to know if he learned something. And he said he'd learned to surf. But a bit like with the maths exam, what he didn't say was, you took me to the car park in Dunbar and we met this man who I'd never met before. And because of the relational capital and experience that I've had since from I was born, perhaps with you and with mum, I was able to trust this man who was asking me to actually go down to the beach with me, with him, and take my clothes off and get into a wetsuit and go into the water. And I had no problem with that, because I could trust him because of all the experience I've had. So I went along, and then when in water, when he was giving me instructions, I was able to internalize and digest those instructions and learn from it. And because of all of that, I was able to learn to surf. Like, he didn't mention any of that. He didn't say that at all. None of that. He just talked about the content stuff, just the visible stuff. He didn't talk about this invisible substrate that sat beneath every single thing that he'd done in that moment. And I would argue that was the only reason he learned to surf, was because he could do that relationship with the person, again, who he'd never met before. But if he didn't trust the person, it might have gone very, very differently. And we've seen those sort of things happen where dropping off in the car park and the guy says, right, let's go down the beach and the surf lesson. And the person who's already learned by the age of 11 that the last thing you do is ever trust a human being might respond in a very different way, like I'm coming down the beach with you, pervert, or whatever. And then something much more complicated would happen, and it wouldn't involve surfing or learning to surf. It would involve something else that might ultimately lead to the boy being told to go and sit in the dunes and by himself and be excluded from the surf lesson so we can get on with the business of learning to surf. And that boy could then sit in the dunes and really reflect on how he's always excluded and that no one understands him and he never gets to take part. And he may have even been told that it was his fault for being cheeky to them in surf instruction somewhere, because the injury is invisible. It would be obvious to see in that moment that this is someone who's bringing a relational injury to the business of learning to surf. And in that particular case, the surf lesson hasn't been set up in a way that is informed by a sort of relational understanding of surfing in this version, but healthcare in other sort of settings. Really. It's always interests me when sort of go around various health facilities, how when you benchmark something like this invented concept of relational injury with something like physical injury, there's very, very big differences that we make understandably and correctly. I think we make adaptations and accommodations for the consequences of the consequences of physical injury. Again, physical injury that may have been caused by trauma, so it may have been caused by a surfing accident or something, and the person may have lost some movement, for example, in their legs, maybe a wheelchair user, and we make adaptation and accommodation for that, such that people can access the healthcare using things like ramps and wider doorways, or adapted toilets, or all sorts of things that take account of the consequences of the physical injury. But when you try and find out, that just says slide deliberately left blank. Probably, yeah, there it goes. Trying to find the sort of adaptations and accommodations that we might make in our health services for people with severe relational injury is harder to find. In fact, I don't know of many. We tend to still do things where we discharge people for not turning up, I don't know, send people letters, ask them to come and see us, assume that they can do the relational steps required to come in from where they are to where we are, connect with us, trust us, tell us what's going on. We make all these assumptions that they have equal relational access to the healthcare that we provide, without sort of recognizing for some, the injury may be the relationship with care itself. We might need to make some adaptations and accommodations to even allow the person to access the goodies that we have available in some way. And sometimes this, I think, is akin to, and I'm hamming up a wee bit, but actually I think it is like this sometimes. We're asking people to do things in traumatic, you know, people have experienced the highest levels of trauma and the highest levels of the most severe sort of relational injuries. We're asking them to do things that we would never get away with in physical injury. We would never go to a scene like this and say, you guys look like you're pretty injured. You should maybe get to A&E. We would never say that. We would understand they can't get to A&E because their hip's smashed. And so we would send an ambulance and facilitate the access between where they are, where the goodies are, recognizing that the injury has interfered with their capacity to access healthcare. It's visible, it's quite hard to miss. In fact, there's laws about this now, you know, in terms of access. You know, you'd be breaking the law if you did that, to sort of say, sorry, you're just gonna have to get there by yourself. But often we are asking people to do the equivalent of it. People with severe relational injuries, we're saying to them, what you really need to do is get to the trauma service, or you need to go and get to see the GP for that, or you should go to the dentist. Okay, like it's that easy, you know, particularly when some of the, not just about the basic trust thing, but about where some of the services actually require contact with the person that might mirror or at least have some connection with original trauma, like dentists, for example, like smear tests, like all sorts of interventions that might require physical contact or sort of connection with people in that sort of way, let alone just the basic thing of being able to go along and be vulnerable and ask for help in relation to somebody else. As I say, I think that akin to at times putting a wheelchair clinic at the top of 3 flights of stairs and 2 escalators, and then wondering why people don't turn up. And then more than that, often locating the responsibility for the not turning upness in the person. We sent you a clinic time. Like we had goodies here. We had it all set up for you. And we'd freed up the time. We had nurses available, doctors available, wheelchair technicians available, and you just didn't come. What's the matter with you? You're just not engaging. You just got some problem. And we were very good at locating it, sometimes into the most vulnerable members of society. I think it takes a specially trained mind to do that, actually, sometimes to locate responsibility into those who have the least power to do anything about it, really. So the way to sort of maybe get around this, some of this would be to try and be informed in a sort of, I mean, there's various buzzwords around this. I'm just going to say psychologically informed. I don't mean it as a trademark. I mean it as a very generic term of trying to inform the way our services are organized based on an understanding of the psychological and emotional and relational needs of some of the people that we might be working with, who might be in the greatest need and who are wondering why they're not turning up. I just put this up because it's an example of a psychologically informed environment. Does everyone know what this is? There's equipment. In our house, we called it the mind gym because we're middle class in that way. I think it actually said it on the box, mind gym. For those of you who haven't used one before, you basically build it. This is the baby. You'll recognize the baby from slide 1. And you slide the baby in one of the entrances, and then you try and go and get some sleep for like 20 minutes if you're lucky. And while you're doing that, they're really being stimulated by all the exciting things that are in the mind gym. And these things aren't random. That's the point, is that they've been informed by psychological knowledge about what babies like. Babies like faces. They like simple faces, 3-dot sort of faces with a mouth. And they also like high contrast stuff. So they're not really interested in they're not interested in Turner, for example. What they're interested in is black and white. So this one's got quite a lot of black and white on it. Like there's a bird here with a black and white stomach. Don't think that occurs in nature, but that's just for the baby's cortex, just to stimulate it. And so pandas, who are black and white and have a face, came from the sort of toy wilderness into center stage, because pandas are like catnip for babies, like babies love catnip. So this is basically a psychologically informed environment where there's been an attempt to understand what the psychological and emotional needs are of the particular client group, and then designed that and organized it and adapted it and accommodated it to suit the needs of the particular person that it's trying to serve. I'm not sure we always do that within, let's call them health services. I was going to use just one example of a term. It often annoys me. People don't use it around me anymore because I used to bang on about it so much, but we spend a lot of time in the homeless practice often talking about people not engaging. What was interesting about that is often there was 6 of us in a room around a table talking about them. Well, when's the last time 6 people sat around a table talking about me? And this person really is engaging. They've got us talking, they've got us going. Maybe they're not engaging in the way we'd like them to engage, with our slightly autistic version of what healthcare is, which is, you know, we designed it, surely, but we offered them an appointment. Why aren't they here? And this is the sort of engagement I think we like, that we send someone an appointment, come along to the clinic, we're here, we're very good at this sort of stuff. You've got a problem, we've got a solution. Come along at 2 o'clock and we'll meet you. My name's Bob. And the person comes along, then we pick them up in the waiting room, we go and sit in the room, they talk about their mother, we say some clever stuff, and they go away feeling great. Like, this is engagement. We like this. This is nice. This is a John Lewis version of healthcare, and makes us all feel clever and able, really. We're not so keen on this sort of engagement. This is Richard. I was meant to have an appointment with him an hour or so ago, and he's engaging with that appointment by not turning up. That's the way he's engaging with it. And maybe he's unconsciously communicating something to me about what it's like to be abandoned or left or forgotten about, or to be annoyed or to be neglected. Maybe I'm getting an experience of what it is like to be neglected in his not turning upness. Maybe I'm really getting a concrete version of what it's like to be forgotten about or to be unimportant in some way. I don't know, maybe it's nothing as complicated as that. Maybe he's just got other things on his mind, or he doesn't have the bus fare to get to the place, or he has such a degree of relational injury that there's no way he's going to come and meet somebody he's never met before, and come to a strange building and sit in a waiting room and come downstairs and have the door shut behind him, and then have somebody ask him about his internal world and his life and how he's feeling. And that would be mad, given the sorts of experiences that he's had. Really, that would be bonkers. That was this thing that always interested me about the term personality disorder, the concept of disorder. It was sort of, no, the disordered thing would be the person that lived through all of those experiences and been injured to that degree that they came along and trusted you. That would truly be mad. That would be crazy. Rather than the person having a very, very ambivalent relationship with you, where part of them maybe asks for care, like with the Gollum picture, and said, no, I really want something. Where are you? I need stuff. And yet later on, another partner says, we're not going anywhere near that. No way we're going to that. And I think that's something a healthcare service really struggles with, is ambivalence. And yet we should understand that it's one of the most important, I think, consequences of relational injury, is to be very in conflict, to have a small vestigial part of the person who says, I need help more than anything in the world. And we might hear from that occasionally. And then when we try and offer the help, another part of the person comes online and says, not on your life. No way, not ever. And kills us off and attacks us, or whatever it might be, with the knives that were thrown at them originally. As I say, again, benchmarking it against things like the money and time that we put into rehabilitation and care of physical injury. I think we really deny. I think there is it's just a lack of recognition of the severity of relational injury and what sort of resources and time we might need to put into that if we actually wanted to sort of care for it in some way. If you're unlucky enough to be in a road traffic accident or something, you're going to spend a lot of time and money on your rehabilitation, and rightly so. I think that's the way it should be. It's visible, we can see it, we know you're in a road traffic. There may even be pictures of the road traffic accident and x-rays of the injury of what happened. We can attend to that in a way that when we meet people with relational injuries, we can't see it. The amount of times you must have sat in meetings where someone says, oh, I think there's a history of sexual abuse. Okay, I'm fine, and we move on. What does that mean? What does it actually mean in terms of what the person lived through on a day-by-day basis? What Wednesday was like in 1975 in that house that they had to live through every single day of it. You don't skip a few days and go next door to see what's happening there because these guys are shit. They don't get that luxury. It's just, this is the experience. But it's not visible. We don't see it. It's somewhere in the history, and so it's easier to not pay attention to, I think, or to not see in some way, and therefore not provide the appropriate level of resources that might be required to repair or try and take care of or accommodate or make allowances for the consequences of that sort of relational injury. Again, I don't know what a relational injury rehab service might like. Well, I have some ideas about it, but we don't have that, do we? We don't have that in the health service, the trust repair service. I haven't seen that yet, but there may be bits of it around, really. I've been involved with Housing First in Edinburgh and a new project called Relationship First, which really just tries to sort of strip it down to its very basic thing, which I think is the closest that it might come to a relational injury rehabilitation service. I guess that we have other models of it. We know that there's a project going on at any one point in time, a sort of multi-centre international trial, if you like, across cultures, which deals with relational care, education, health, all sorts of things. And it's called The Family, and it comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And most patients leave the family doing all right, actually. And when they're discharged, they go off and they make other families and all sorts of other stuff. This is my small family. This is Claire in the background. Judy's a bit bigger than that now. That's Iris, looking very cute. And again, like with the, I remember I was trying to argue for Housing First in Edinburgh. The example I gave was of Jude and Iris, and Jude's had 16 years of Housing First at this stage. By that, I mean he's had 16 years of residential, full-time, 24/7 care by 2 carers. And he's still not ready for discharge. He still can't find his pants in the morning, let alone, go off and live by himself. That's the volume and time required to prepare somebody to a point where they could go off and live and connect. And that's from a relatively blank slate. It's not that we picked them up and they'd already had 25 years of severe mistreatment, abuse and neglect. Luckily, they were just born into a reasonably good Housing First project. And we don't discharge them. Like once they leave, they can come back and say, sorry, you had your 18 years, that's it. And they take it for granted, really, as they should. What a nice thing to be able to do. And most of us, if we're lucky, have had some kind of housing first experience or have had this relational care service throughout our life that has allowed us to do a lot of the things that we do. It's always interested me that when we come to design services to repair or try and account for the consequence of people who really haven't had this sort of experience, and the things that we build look nothing like this. In fact, they look far more like broken families than they do like healthy families. They often end up concretely reenacting the very dynamics that brought the person looking for care in the first place. There's all sorts of reasons for that, which we haven't got time to get into today, but it's an interesting discussion, really. So yeah, this is, probably can't see all of that, but what it says is there's no such thing as a patient. I said that in 2019, apparently, for the eagle-eyed amongst you will see that I sort of slightly stole that from Winnicott and just changed one of the words, really. But I suppose it's really just to bring around to the beginning again and say, as soon as you say the word patient, you're talking about someone else. You're talking about someone who calls somebody a patient. So immediately you have a relationship. It describes the relationship intrinsically in the word. As soon as you call somebody a patient, we're talking about a group of people, doctors, nurses, who call people patients. And often the relationship's invisible. We just assume that, as I say, everybody has this equal access to it. But I think what I'm arguing for is that those who've experienced the highest levels often of social inequality, deprivation, neglect, abuse, trauma in the very broadest sense, they don't have equal relational access to the care that might be useful to them. And we might need to make some accommodations for that. The last few slides, stop really. We're just about thinking about the other side of the dynamic, that if we are going to work in this area and take seriously that we might be working with people who are bringing big relational injuries, is that we might need to think about support for ourselves in that way. If we're going to work in very unsettled, choppy relational waters, we are going to get thrown around all over the place. And I think if we're not taken care of, it becomes much easier to do things like start discharging people and enacting something back towards people who bring their history to us in the moment. It always interests me again in the sort of trauma-informed world that we seem to forget sometimes that the one thing we should know about trauma is it's traumatic. So sometimes when people bring trauma into the relationship with us, it's going to be traumatic. We might end up feeling abused. We might end up feeling neglected, mistreated in all sorts of ways that are a manifestation of the person's relational injury. You don't have a choice in this. It's not, I must wake up this morning, go down and noise up the healthcare worker and recreate my past in the present. I don't think it works that way. Choice is an interesting one, again, which we've really got time to get into, but going back to the earlier slides, it's a word that we use a lot to locate responsibility into people. I don't know if anyone here felt like they chose their mind. I don't know that I did particularly. You got the mind that you got, didn't you? You got the parents that you got. And everyone would end up, if anyone here has ever tried to change their mind, and by that I mean not go to the gym a bit more or stop smoking, but I mean stop being you and be someone else, it's really, really hard to change your mind in that way. And yet often we're asking people to stop being them. Could you just stop being someone who's a bit fearful of care? No, I might like to, but it's not possible. I can't just talk or think my way out of it in some way. There's someone, again, same person actually, because she's brilliant at these phrases. She came up with a phrase, because we were like known each other for a good 15 years by that stage, and said, yeah, where are we with the trust thing, do you think? And she goes, well, I think I trust you. Yeah, I think I trust you. And she'd been studying psychology at college by that stage, and she'd been learning about language development and sort of critical periods, about critical early stages in life. And she'd learned about, if a child isn't exposed to language in the first few years of life, then they will never speak the language fluently. They'll learn to speak it, but it will always not be like this. It won't be 100 miles an hour like this. And she goes, well, I think I do trust you, but I think I'll always speak trust as a second language, which I think really captures something of the severity of it, that even after all this time and in her 30s, the injury remains. And I think we would have to expect that. We wouldn't say to people with a spinal injury, yeah, you'll walk again in a few years. No, we know that there's some injuries that will have lifelong effects, and we might always need to make adaptation and accommodation for. And it's easy with the visible ones, but what she's referring to is an invisible one. We can't see her trust damage, not visible, but it is massively life limiting in terms of her capacity to do things like access healthcare, access education, access a social group, access the community, the world, all the things that we might otherwise sort of take for granted. But us on the other side of that, again, if we're not to, both for our own well-being, but also to try and protect ourselves from reenacting some of these dynamics, it might be useful to have things like reflective practice, places where we can meet and have a think about what it's like to be in dynamics, relationships that bring trauma and bring histories that are complicated. And they don't need to be shocking and difficult. It's not really about, saying we're worried about reflective practice. It's about talking about what we did wrong. I think the point of the previous slide is you pop yourself into these sorts of relational waters, you will get thrown about. And that's not a failing, far from it. It's absolutely to be expected that you might get to a point where you feel something towards somebody that is not necessarily benevolent, because that's the relational waters that we're in. You might even find yourself hating someone or really disliking them or wishing they'd disappear. And if we have a place to think about that and try and understand it and metabolize it, then it might be less likely that we enact it by doing things like discharging them or banning them or calling them personality disordered, or all the other sort of subtle ways in which we enact some of our own feelings back towards people who don't make us feel good all the time. I'd say that's it should be a very integral part of the work that we do in this area. A bit like the again, back to visibility and invisibility. When there's visible dangers at work, we're very good at sort of legislating for them and putting up signs like this that say, like, if you don't have this and you don't have this on and you don't have those on, well, you're not coming in. You're not coming into the building site. It's not like, okay, if there's a hard hat, put it on, but if there's not, don't worry, just crack on. Like, no. You're not coming into the building site unless you've got adequate protection. We don't have a psychological version of this because the masonry, the relational masonry that often we're exposed to isn't visible, it's invisible, but it can have consequences for us, both acutely and chronically in terms of our well-being. And I think also for the people who we're trying to help, in that unless we take care of that side of things, it's much more likely, I think, that we will enact dynamics back towards people that are unlikely to be helpful to them and may, as I say, even end up being a concrete reenactment of the very thing that brought them looking for sort of help in the first place. So yes, it's the invisible man. I think there's a number of bits of invisibility there which I've sort of spoken about, and the complications that can arise from that. What's nice about this image is he's made visible, isn't he? Like we wrap bandages around, so he's invisible, but we can kind of see him really. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to do today in a rather rushed manner, but to try and shine a light on sort of invisible relational dynamics that are a consequence of the relational injuries that I think people experience, typically as a consequence of trauma and other relational adversity, that despite being invisible, can have massive consequences across the lifespan in terms of just being able to access anything that we might take for granted, ranging from social group to coming to see a GP for something that's eminently treatable, but they cannot climb the relational stairs to get there. And we can't see that. It's not visible in that sort of way, but I think I would argue it's something that we really need to take account of if we're to provide a healthcare system that is truly trauma-informed, psychologically informed, takes very seriously that sometimes the people in the greatest need in terms of their mental health care, physical health care, may be the least able to relationally access the services that we have put at the top of relational stairs and not even realize we've done it. Because we breathe so easily, we assume everybody else. That's the end really, apart from, I put that slide up because it's quite funny. But also I think it sort of exemplifies sometimes we're doing some really batshit crazy stuff, but we locate it often into the person, you know, rather than try to think about how we might be setting ourselves up in relation to people. One of the things we used to play around with the access practice, if I say play me, I was just such a pedant about language really, but we talk about people not attending and trying to flip that and then say, well, what have we not attended to such that this person isn't here? Because we know about them. And at some point, a part of them seems to have managed to communicate to us that they're in need and they're not here. And we're saying they didn't attend, which they didn't in that sort of very concrete version of things. But we spend very little time thinking about what did we not attend to in the sort of relational contract or the relational dynamic between us as healthcare providers and the person who came looking for care. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam. I'm just going to try and stop sharing these last slides and say hello to people who are online and also people who are here in the audience. We've got 10 minutes for questions or comments. I'd like to maybe invite somebody from the audience to begin with. And then if I'm going to have a look, well, I clearly can't multitask. That's been evidenced by the IT and stuff that's been going on. I'll have a look and see what people are putting up in the chat. Barry.
That was fantastic presentation. It was really inspirational and really wonderfully communicated. I wonder if you can reflect on the fact that you position